Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Welcome to day 13 of Surah al-Baqarah. The intention is to finish today with the surah and then leave the entire next halakha session for Q&A. So I can't believe that after 13, 14 total sessions, we're going to be at the end of this surah. It's been an incredible journey. I know people have reached out to me to tell me how incredible it's been and how much it's made a difference in their lives. And so I'm so excited to just still have 2 more days to eke out. So, but if you have any questions, definitely send them to me by email. So hopefully, I know that, 13 days worth of questions hopefully will be a lot. So we'll try and cover as much as we can, inshallah. It should be wonderful. Just to give an update, last halakha I was talking about Julius Jones, an African American who was on death row and about to be put to death. And alhamdulillah, if you've been following it or if you haven't been following it, in the last hours, the Oklahoma governor did stay his execution. So the good news is that he was not put to death. But the bad news is that the governor continued to ignore the recommendation of the parole board and commuted his sentence to life without the possibility of parole. So he's alive, but if they're going to put him back into solitary confinement, I'm not sure if that's better. So I hope and pray that they're continuing to fight that fight, but at least they have more time since he is alive. And inshallah, I hope that this is something that people will continue to fight for. So thank you. I know some people had let me know that they did make some calls on his behalf because they heard about it here. So I'm really grateful and thank you so much for that. Okay, I wanted to just highlight, I know we have been doing, Ramin's been doing an amazing job cutting some excerpts and posting them on YouTube. And these are like wonderful nuggets of information and hopefully, is a nice way to entice people to see, what we're up to without having to jump into a 4, 5, 6 hour halakha. And so we had a really lovely, this was a clip that Ramin just put up, which was this from yesterday's, the last halakha?
Yeah, day 12.
Okay, from day 12. And so it's called What Pain and Hardship Can Teach You. It's a really wonderful, it's a 6-minute video. It's a reflection that where Sheikh was talking about how our society is so quick to want to just address things like pain and anxiety or depression with a pill. And that there is, another side of it, which is, taking those, the pain and the anxiety and turning it to a way to learn and elevate. And so if you've been following the things that we've been talking about here, obviously that's a beautiful quote. And I think if you only hear that excerpt in isolation without knowing all of that, then you would expect some of the comments that we got. And so I wanted to just share a comment, and I appreciate the comments because it's important to highlight these issues. I think some of the reaction was, well, let me read you this one. So, Salam Sheikh, I much appreciate your scholarship, but this is just sending the wrong message. It is better to leave these issues to mental health professionals, such as, for example, the experts at the Stanford Muslim Mental Health and Psychology Lab. Thank you for your good work on Islamic theology and jurisprudence. So I just wanted to comment on that. I mean, clearly, if you know anything about what we're doing, we are not advocates of throwing out modern medicine or mental health. I mean, clearly, you have to try every available option and technology for you. I mean, sometimes mental health issues are, an issue of physiology or chemistry, and they need to be treated with medical professionals. And so I think it's a mistake if someone watches a 6-minute clip and somehow thinks that they need to comment and say, better to leave this to mental health professionals, as if this is a replacement for mental health care that someone might need. So, I just wanted to say that. Hopefully it's not something that needed to be said, but the fact that someone commented, we did then follow up by putting up a disclaimer and saying, this is obviously not advice to, not get medical treatment that, you might potentially need. But the point is that there is a spiritual component that is often overlooked. And so, that is something important, and I think it's an incredible bit of wisdom because a lot of times, people just want to quell the pain or silence the pain and not necessarily see it as a potential for learning or elevation. And certainly, we, as people know, have dealt with so many different health issues. And have been through, endless amounts of medication and pain pills and all of that kind of stuff. So we certainly have a lot of experience with, what the limitations and benefits are of, medicine that you take to address things like pain. So, this is also, an insight as to our own personal experience. And also, I wanted to comment on this last little part, which is thank you for your good work on Islamic theology and jurisprudence, which, I'm kind of cynical sometimes, so I take that as a very polite way of saying stay in your own lane, right? Like, thank you for your, focus on law and theology and jurisprudence, and stay out of medicine or, mental health. And so it reminded me of a story that I just thought I would share. This was a world that I was introduced to when I met the sheikh, and after we got married. It was just amazing to, as a convert, you come in and you kind of learn what you get at the mosque, and so it's a whole new world that you get exposed to when you're married to a sheikh. And so this was one of the things that was so fascinating to me that I thought I would just share, is how he had his training, studying at the feet of sheikhs, and in the whole halakha system, and certainly I'm not an expert on that, so I really can't speak to the details, but I know that it was just so fascinating how sheikh was educated under so many other sheikhs before him, and that there was a very sophisticated system of learning that just doesn't exist now. It's been pretty much destroyed, or if it exists, it's somewhere probably in the underground. But what he told me were the stories about how as you studied and as you progressed, you would earn like ijazas or licenses. So you would maybe gain mastery over a particular subject matter, and the sheikh that you would study under would issue an ijaza if you mastered whatever topic, and then perhaps you could go on to the next level. But at some point you have to reach a point where you actually choose a specialty. So you could either go to recitation, you could go to exorcism, you could go to different kinds of things, and he chose the most difficult path, which is law and jurisprudence. And the reason why it's the most difficult is that in order to gain mastery, where you are actually, issuing, whether it's fatwas or, scholarship or knowledge that affects people, in the entirety of their life, you have to have mastered so many different systems of knowledge. And it just, this comment reflects again kind of what we covered in the last halakha, which is the idea of law almost as a proxy for morality and agency. It's kind of like, we have a tendency in modern day to just say, oh, this hadith says this, so therefore that's the ruling, regardless of the nuance, regardless of any other factor or other systems of knowledge. It's, we have this tendency to just pluck little things and then say, oh, okay, now I've done my duty, as opposed to, with regard to what is moral or ethical or, Islamic. And that's just simply not the case. So this, this comment really reflects, again, that sort of mentality, and it's just a nice, it's sort of a stark contrast to what we've been learning here, especially in Surah Baqarah, that, you can't just point to, an isolated positive law or hadith, but there's a whole world of morality and ethics that needs to, go into that. And so as a scholar, when you're talking about whether it's, mental health or things like that, I mean, this is, I think that from my perspective, it's wisdom that comes from a different place, that integrates all of these different systems of knowledge. And so it's really not appropriate to say, stay in your lane, law, you're about law, and so that means you really can't speak about anything else. So I just wanted to share that, just my 2 cents, and for what that's worth. And I am so excited to, inshallah, we'll see if we actually finish. Our intention is always to say, okay, we're going to conclude, but please don't rush. Take your time. If we need to take another day or two, I think we would all be very happy, so that we don't miss anything that we won't have a chance to learn again in the future. So thank you so much for joining us, and inshallah, I look forward to another amazing session.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين سبحان الله العلي العظيم اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه واتبعوا بإحسان إلى يوم الدين اللهم اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي يا رب العالمين توكلنا على الله لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. I didn't, of course, I don't know what Grace is going to talk about in her comments, so I wasn't aware of. But I don't care what the comments are, to be quite honest. But I think it raises something that I do want to comment on before we go on. If you notice, life cannot be cleanly segmented and compartmentalized as we often try to do with the it's one thing to be trained professionally so you can undertake a licensed job. So in other words, you are going to earn a living performing a certain profession. But it is quite another to use the claim of professionalism to try to clear space from any countervailing discourses. It's quite another to claim professionalism in order to claim competence over a space as if life doesn't present us with constantly overlapping moral spaces. So it's, put it differently, it's quite another, it's one thing to say you need a license to practice law and to give legal advice. But it is quite another if a psychologist critiques the way law handles an issue, for me to come to say to this psychologist, well, stay in your lane, you don't know anything about law because you're not a lawyer. That would strike us as patently absurd. It is, again, one thing to say, in order to practice law, you need to be licensed as a lawyer. In order to practice mental health, you need to be licensed as a mental health provider. But it's quite another to use the claim of professionalism in order to censor overlapping considerations. So if you notice, law deals with mental health all the time. We take someone and we hold this person culpable and we make a judgment about their mental state, about their intentions, about their legal culpability, and sometimes even their moral culpability. And we might, in some cases, bring in mental health providers to testify, but ultimately the judgment rests with law. So law overlaps with mental health all the time. But even what Grace was alluding to, in my view, you cannot be a faqih in the modern age. You cannot be a faqih in the modern age without educating yourself in numerous overlapping fields, because you are representing Sharia. And Sharia is about what Allah is telling us about how we should live our lives. You can't do that unless you take your job extremely seriously. So of course, this person has no clue that through my education, I've taken numerous courses in psychology, enough for a major. There was one course that I didn't take in order to actually have a double major in psychology. But other than that, it doesn't matter, because also this person is not aware that I've read more books in psychology than the vast majority of licensed psychologists. The difference is I read psychology not to provide mental health advice in a clinical sense. I read psychology to understand when Allah talks about culpability, and Allah talks about ma'ruf, and Allah talks about ihsan, and Allah talks about fitrah, how to understand what Allah is saying. I cannot make sense of anything that Allah is saying if I don't understand something about human psychology. So that type of comment, thanks for your insights on law and theology, but basically stay in your lane, because that's an implication, only betrays this person's small-mindedness and remarkable ignorance. I don't know who this person is, and I don't care to know who this person is, but only betrays the amazing amount of jahl, pure jahl, in what law, theology, morality, ethics are about. Now, it is obvious, I think it is obvious, it only takes the type of petty takedowns that Muslims are so good at doing to each other. Muslims are diseased with jealousies and feeling threatened by each other and feeling insecure vis-a-vis each other. Muslims allow themselves to be flagellated and abused and degraded by the other, by the non-Muslim, by the white-skinned prototype, by the colonial master. But with each other, they act like so many colonized people. They're petty, they engage in constant infighting, they constantly snap at each other like dogs when they are under stress and pressure and tension. Poor dogs, when you stress them out, they start snapping at each other. They don't snap at their owner. Muslims, that's precisely what they do. It is precisely a display of that phenomena. You know, let me flex my muscles at my fellow Muslim, rather than understand what the heck they're talking about, and rather than worry about my position professionally vis-a-vis the world at large, whether in fact anyone in the field of psychology actually respects me, rather than flexing muscles at a fellow Muslim. It irritates me. It irritates me because it is symptomatic of precisely what Muslims do all the time. It is clear what I'm talking about, and I don't need to be a licensed psychologist to say this, that I, Khalid Abul Fadl, learned a great deal from pain. And that my experiences in life and everything that I was taught from my teachers, from my shuyukh, and from my parents, is that pain, and in fact, I would go even further, from my God, that pain is a mihna. And every mihna is a trial and a tribulation, but also an opportunity for growth. That when Allah says, لا يكلف الله نفسا إلا وسعها لها ما كسبت وعليها ما اكتسبت, that Allah does not ask a soul to bear more than it can, then Allah is telling me something about the psychology of a mihna. That when I am tried, I should not break, I should not crumble, I should not surrender. I must learn from the challenges and the tests that Allah presents me with. That, of course, does that discount the possibility that there are people who are really ill, who really need medicine? Obviously not. You and whoever this person is are educated enough to have that as a fair assumption in the way we relate to each other in our discourse. Unless you're being petty, being like a crab in a barrel, or being like a dog under stress. That's a fair assumption. You are educated, I am educated, and the fair assumption is that we have these cases where there is a chemical imbalance or some type of clinical issue that requires intervention by highly specialized people, which, by the way, in my book are not psychologists. It's really psychiatrists, medically trained people. Psychologists are as specialized as I am because they don't have medical training. They like to pretend that they have a specialty. But you read enough psychology, you can be as knowledgeable as a psychologist. But anyway, and this is not to take away from psychologists. My mother was a psychologist. May Allah bless her soul. And I, of course, have enormous respect for her and her knowledge and her expertise. But my mother would never make a comment, an idiotic comment like that. A fair assumption in discourse is that, of course, we're not talking about clinical cases. We are talking about general morality that we can impart to our children. And when I tell my child, don't surrender to depression, fight depression, learn from depression, learn from anxiety. In fact, there is just a book that I've read that talks about how new clinical studies are showing that depression and anxiety are, of course, they use evolutionary logic, are evolution's way of teaching us methods of survival, and in fact that they are, in many occasions, healthy responses that the modern human being has forgotten how to react to productively rather than destructively. It's absurd. But it irritates me because Muslims irritate me. The way Muslims are petty and small and narrow-minded with each other and snap at each other and take down each other or are quickly threatened by each other means we will never emerge as a dignified people on the human stage. We will never reach the normative demands of Surah Al-Baqarah upon us as long as we remain in our psychology. And I notice I use the word psychology. In our psychology, a thoroughly colonized people, displaying all the psychological symptoms of a thoroughly colonized people. Do you need a license to say something like that? That would be the height of absurdity. Have you read Charles Taylor and how much psychology is in Charles Taylor's philosophy? Or should I say to Charles Taylor, don't say anything about social thought because just worry about theology and law? It's absurd. It's ridiculous. And the sad thing is that it's only in Muslim circles that you can say something like that and go around feeling proud of yourself and don't realize the extent to which you've exposed yourself as a thorough and complete idiot. لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله. May Allah protect us from our own idiocies. and the idiocies of our brethren. Let's proceed. Where are we? Okay. So, where we stopped, remember, Surah Al-Baqarah talks about an exploitative financial institution that not only existed in Mecca, but by the way, and I didn't say this last halaqah, it has been in existence for centuries. If you read, for instance, what the Bible reports about what Jesus says to the money lenders in the temple, some of the harshest discourses that are reported or attributed to Jesus, to Isa ibn Maryam alayhi salam, is in response to this same financial institution, because the temple, there are, depending on the historian you read, either the money lenders were inside the temple in the outer sahn, or the outer area of the temple, or they had set up shops around the temple. And Jesus is constantly confronting them and condemning their exploitative financial practices, and basically telling them that all pretenses that you are religious, moral people are entirely false. And so money lending in this way has been a recurrent institution in the Near East, with fairly sometimes complex infrastructure. But what is consistent about it is that it preserved class privilege, and it perpetuated the disempowerment of people who would fall into the trap of needing to go to the moneylenders. Now, once the Quran talks about this institution and condemns it, and in fact describes it in rather very strong terms, both as if these people are possessed by shaitan, the clear implication is that an obsessive love of money, or a preoccupation with earning money regardless of the morality of how you earn it, if all you care about is making the money, then it is, the Quran describes it as if you are possessed by a shaitan, a demon. But then also a very powerful condemnation that the people who translate this demonic attitude into an actual exploitative practices, it is as if they are at war with Allah and His Prophet. And the Quran uses this expression, at war with Allah and the Prophet, in a few instances, but in every instance it connotes an absolute condemnation of the practice. But then the Quran goes on to continue to talk about debt itself. And as we said last halaqah, that it advises people that their attitude towards the need of other human beings, when other human beings have a need and they need to borrow money, is to be patient, to be understanding, to be benevolent. And that even if that they don't need the debt, if they don't need the money paid back, to just forgive it. And that's, of course, a tough thing, because you ask yourself, do I really need the money back? Or is it just that, all the psychological, all the psychological things that we tell ourselves, right? Sometimes we even say we want the money back as a matter of principle, just because I don't want to feel taken advantage of. Well, if you're listening to what Allah is telling you, forgiving a debt that if you don't need the money, is always better for you. Even if people say that you're kind and silly and stupid and, naive and, all the type of stuff that all the types of things that people say about people who are generous and moral. There are traditions that the Prophet ﷺ, there are many traditions attributed to the Prophet about forgiveness of debt. But there are a few traditions that were reported to have been said in the context of Surah Al-Baqarah's discourse, and are reported widely in tafsir and hadith literature, obviously, within this context. One such tradition says, من أنظر معسرا أو وضع عنه أظله الله في ظل عرشه يوم لا ظل إلا ظله. And another example is من أحب أن تستجاب دعوته وتكشف كربته فلييسر على المعسر. And من أنظر معسرا فله في كل يوم صدقة أجر صدقة, and so on. Okay, so what are these traditions saying? That first, the Prophet ﷺ comments that those who أنظر معسرا means someone. Mu'sir is someone who is in need, someone who is experiencing financial hardship. That's a mu'sir. It's not necessarily a faqir is someone who's poor, but a mu'sir is someone who experiences financial hardship. So man anzara mu'siran means someone who helps someone in financial hardship and is patient with them, so that they lend them money and helps them patiently until they emerge out of this financial hardship. Or wada'a anhu means you help without expecting a payback. So the Prophet ﷺ says that whoever does that, either helping patiently or even better, helping with no expectation of return, that such people will be in a special status in the hereafter, that Allah will encompass them under Allah's dhil, or Allah's dhil is Allah's shadow, but it's not, it idiomatically doesn't translate, because it's being in a shadow doesn't necessarily mean a good thing in English, but idiomatically in Arabic, when you say that someone will be under someone else's shadow means that you will be under their care. So basically that they will come in the hereafter and they will have a special status with Allah, that Allah will take care of them as special standouts, people who especially stand out. Other hadiths that were also reported in this context, that whoever wants his dua answered should help a mu'sir. Again, either through helping them and being patient with them, or helping them without an expectation of return, and that's always superior. And then there are many other hadiths that were reported in different contexts that say that whoever lends someone in hardship money and is patient with them, that Allah, for every day that they are patient with the loan, that Allah bestows enormous gifts and bounties upon them. You know, in the hadith, again, in medieval narratives, which is always taken towards exaggeration, in medieval narratives that for every day Allah builds a castle for them in the hereafter. And of course that's not a literal castle, but it means that they have a very special status for every day that they are patient. So why am I underscoring this? I underscore this because we are accustomed to saying, tell me what the rules are about the waiting period on talaq. Tell me what the rules are about, the technicalities of whether this divorce is valid or is not invalid or whatever. But we often come to what is a higher order normative command. A higher order means something more foundational. We often because the modern mind is empirically oriented. Empirically oriented means that the modern mind is raised to relate to what it can see and touch. Is this psychology, people? It drives me insane. The modern mind relates to what it can see and it can touch. And we, in our school system, when we insist, we send our kids to school, all the years in school, they are not tested unless they go to special schools or, they're not tested on their power of imagination. They're not tested on their, normally their artistic abilities. They're not tested on the way that they can relate to nature, or the way that they can hear the sounds of nature, or the way that they can notice things in creation. They're tested on verifiable empirical knowledge. And so this is the age of empiricism, which is, in some meta histories, is often contrasted to the age of magical thinking. But anyway, and because of that, when this modern mind goes to law and morality, you are very different than your grandparents or your great-grandparents. Your great-grandparents could be raised with someone, saying, "A'mal al-tayyib," always do what is kind. And everything in their upbringing, in their culture, that was not yet thoroughly empirical, they could relate to that in so many nuanced ways that is completely alien to the modern mind. The modern mind tends to not know how to relate to abstractions and generalities and say, okay, what's concrete? What's specific? Give me a rule. Something, something black and white, like the type of answer I would give on an SAT exam or an LSAT exam or an MCATS exam, all the exams that are administered all around the world to assess intellectual ability. And as a result, if you talk to your grandparents, and I'm sure of this, if they grew up in a Muslim society, just much older generations, they will tell you that yes, in the society we grew up, it was people lending other people money and being patient about them, and even forgiving the loans altogether. It was practiced not just widely, but it was very meaningful for a person to say to them in very concrete terms, well, my ajr is with Allah, and to think very concretely about this, far more concrete than the black and white issues that we seek. But with the march of empiricism, we've lost our ability to relate to these values. So even you come today and you tell a person, if you don't need the money, just forgive it. And it is extremely destabilizing. Again, is this psychology? It is it makes them feel anxious. So I am supposed to evaluate whether I really need the money or not. And this is what Allah expects me to do. Where's the black letter law? Where's the black and white yardstick? But you know what? In my view, this is not just a movement towards empiricism in the modern age. It is a movement towards amorality. As human beings, yes, they gained so much by all the scientific standards that they developed to relate to the world, but they also lost a great deal. I mean, think of it. We've gained the ability to put organs from one body into another body. But with that knowledge came a huge moral responsibility. And I can tell you that whether in medical schools, or because I've done a lot of reading on that, or in law schools, or in business schools, the way we teach ethics is basically like, just get it out of the way so we can say we've taught ethics. And even the way ethics are taught, they're reduced into black letter law so that law students or medical students can relate to them, rather than these where you develop the moral character of the being, which requires investing in a human being's spirituality, the way that they relate to a higher power, which of course our modern educational systems cannot do, and in fact are instructed not to do. You can't talk to students about their spirituality. That's not professional in the way we've constructed our modern educational systems. This is part of why, and and if Muslims rise to the challenge of being shuhada ala nas, this challenge of shahada, where they actually then can provide a corrective spectrum as to the trajectory of humanity, since all the major religious traditions retreated and secularism in the sense of a-religious traditions have stepped to the forefront. And secularism co-opted religion, so that religion often became something that is marshaled in the service of empirical causes like colonialism. I mean, listen, once upon a time, people who were businessmen, merchants, they can go travel to Java and trade with Java, and through trade suddenly find Muslim populations sprouting. These merchants were not trained theologians or trained jurists, but the way human beings related to each other. A human being before the age of empiricism could deal with a merchant and could see simply the morality of the merchant and be so blown away, because to them that is so much more meaningful than any scientific gadgets this merchant might have, that they immediately say, oh my God, I have to follow your religion. The modern age doesn't work that way. The modern age, we don't relate to morality that way anymore. So someone can lend me money and can say, you need this money, I forgive the debt. I will take this. I might be even a little suspicious as to why. I might be grateful, you're a wonderful person, but I might think maybe you're a bit naive. I might have all types of psychological reactions to this, but the age where a simple act of generosity like this would say, oh my God, you represent to me a moral universe that I must discover. And so I become a Muslim. And so through trade, through merchants, Islam spread in Indonesia far more effectively than it ever spread in Egypt, for instance. Right? Because Indonesia became largely Muslim, nearly in its entirety. While Egypt, the Coptic population never converted. The Christian population in Syria never converted. It was the way people related to morality was at a much more fundamental and psychologically impactful way than the modern mind. Now, all of this, the reason I'm flagging all of this is because we must learn to relate to the Quran and understand that when Allah talks about something like debt and the way we relate to forgiveness of debt or reacting to the hardship of a fellow human being, as I will talk about inshallah in the summary, that is at a foundational level, at a root cause level, is far more fundamental than a positive legal command that only comes as a result of the moral foundations. And we'll see more about this in a second. Okay. So then Surah Al-Baqarah moves on to talk about another recurrent issue, And it is truly remarkable because here, it's more comfortable. Here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala intervenes with something that how do I put it? That in the historical context was considered as aggressive or as unusual as demanding that women inherit, for instance. And that is the process of documentation of debts. There are reports, none of them reliable, about that claim that there was an occasion of a revelation of this verse about the writing of debts, a dispute that arose, but it's not, the chain of transmission is very problematic. But anyway, so يا أيها الذين آمنوا إذا تداينتم بدين إلى أجل مسمى فاكتبوه وليكتب بينكم كاتب بعدل ولا يأبى كاتب أن يكتب كما علمه الله فليكتب وليملل الذي عليه الحق وليتق الله ربه ولا يبخس منه شيئا, and so on. So the instruction, notice how many times the word yaktub, the kitaba, to write, is mentioned in a single ayah. And so if there is a debt between you, then the instruction is to write it, and the instruction is even goes a step further and instructs who should be the one that dictates the actual language that verifies the debt. And it should be the person alayhi al-haq, the person who is borrowing the money. This in itself, if you realized, if you had studied comparative law and legal history, this is a huge step. That you are saying it's not the lender that writes or that dictates the terms. So it is saying the person who takes on the financial obligation has to agree, or has to, in fact, is the one that's dictating the terms, meaning that they have to be fully aware of what that contract says. This is no small point in comparative law. It takes human legal thinking centuries. And even the idea that it takes centuries to come to the point that saying, well, eventually law adopts an assumption that you've actually read and you are aware of all the terms. That's why, when you buy a car or buy a fridge or buy whatever, you're often surprised what the actual terms of what you've signed say. Law adopts a fiction. And this is, by the way, it was adopted both in the common law and the civil law system, that you have read and you are aware, and it's because even if you have not read, then you should have read the terms. And that's sort of the legal assumption. But the Quranic treatment is quite remarkable because this is not a writing society. And this is not a society that is accustomed to reducing transactions into writing. In fact, among the so-called hypocrites, part of their criticism of this Quranic revelation is that they say something like ما بال رب محمد لا يأمن الناس, or something like that. That, oh, look, Muhammad's God is teaching people not to trust each other. Because in this culture, you know, people are bound by their word. And they give, you know, my word is, these are the terms for the sale, and they're bound by them. But the thing, though, is that in Meccan and Medinian culture, there is an enormous amount of feuds that go back, that are centuries old, because of people disagreeing about the promise made. No, these were not the terms I had promised. No, these are the terms. And for generation after generation, they would fight about what the terms were, and it would, of course, start out as a financial matter, then turned into a prolonged blood feud. So several principles. Avoid legal conflicts by writing. And the one who bears financial responsibility, or the buyer rather than the seller, must be, in the Quranic ideal, it must be the one that dictates the terms, or must be the one that provides the actual. And in Islamic law, there are like long debates about, well, what if the seller has formas, or sukuk, like ready-made contracts. So then they understood from the Quranic prescription that the issue is whether the buyer is fully aware of the terms, and whether the buyer has an opportunity, or the borrower either, has an opportunity to vary the terms of the contract. Or whether this was sort of a contract of adhesion, where the buyer had no opportunity to negotiate terms or vary terms, and so on. And that's a long, complicated legal issue. Okay. And then it particularly talks about what happens if a party in the contract doesn't have full mental capacity. So فإذ كان الذي عليه الحق سفيها أو ضعيفا أو لا يستطيع أن يمل أن يمل هو فليملل وليه بالعدل. So if the person has some reduced mental capacity, and there are, of course, as you can imagine, long legal discussion about what a safih is, what a da'if is, or someone who is unable to dictate terms, then you bring a representative to dictate the terms. And then it enshrines another principle that was radical for that society and that time, and that is that no legal responsibility can be borne by witnesses. That witnesses are not part to a contract. They are only responsible for witnessing the authenticity of the dynamic and the process and the signature. But the old Near Eastern practice that existed in some areas of Arabia, of Yemen, of Iraq, that witnesses would be considered sureties to a contract. And so often what the old legal practice was, the lender, the stronger party, would require that the borrower would bring their witnesses with them, and if you cannot satisfy the debt from the borrower, you can satisfy the debt from the witnesses to the contract, because the witnesses were considered to have acted as sureties for the borrower. And the Quran comes and says, basically, this exploitative practice, because it was exploitative, because it was only practices by the powerful against the weak. That, I'm not going to lend you money, and I'm not going to give you what you need unless you bring your witnesses, but then I can go after your witnesses. And even in old Near Eastern practice, it is not just that you could go after the witnesses financially, but you could actually you could trap the witnesses into indentured servitude. So basically they're sort of like slaves for you, paying off the debt that they witnessed. So that's why the Quran comes in and says that practice has to end. Then notice what was, again, at the time, quite radical, that women can witness a contract. And some of the most interesting reports we have about this is, I forgot who it was that commented in response to this Quranic revelation, and are women ever present in a contract? Like, what is the Quran talking about? Women can witness a contract? Well, since when are women present in contracts? Now, a couple of things I want to say about this. And again, you're free to take it or leave it or accept it or not. That's not, when the Quran makes an intervention like this, when the Quran makes an intervention that is not responsive to actual social practices, or that does not, in fact, simply take what the social practices that existed as they are, but actually injects a new practice into a non-existing social practice, such as women witnessing contracts. What I pay attention to is the obvious question of why. So why, if women are not present in contracts, and we don't have a single report anywhere that women would be the one acting as, in business settings, as witnesses, why does the Quran come and say, and women? That assertive or affirmative step is what catches my attention. Second, whenever the Quran sets a law, and that law is mu'allal means that there is a justification given for the law, then the established legal qaida, the legal rule is al-illa taduru ma'al ma'lul wujudan wa adaman. That if Allah says, here is the way I am interjecting in this matter, and I am giving you an explanation. Allah sometimes decrees laws and doesn't give us an explanation. And like Salah, right? Then you can't, then it's just a rule. And it's a rule that we can speculate as to the wisdom behind the rule. But there is no operative cause. There's no actual justification given to you by the musharra, by the legislator. But when Allah gives a justification, then the legal principle or the foundational maxim of law is that the law, the law acts like the law acts like a door with a handle. The handle is the operative cause, and the operative cause controls the door. Whether the operative cause exists or doesn't exist, it tells us how to handle the law. So what is remarkable here is that, one, the interjection of women, and then it, as if Allah knew that the objection to women is that they have no experience, and what business is it of theirs? So you get a moderated interjection by saying, okay, well, 2 women, and responds to the inevitable objection, and that's the illah, and that's the mu'allal, that so that if one of these women forgets, then the other can remind her. As if saying, Allah knows that you will object that women don't have experience. So I'm telling you, well, in order to satisfy your concerns and your worries, it's 2 women. Now, interestingly, in Islamic legal practice, there are institutions that developed centuries later of professional witnesses in response to this Quranic prescription. And these professional witnesses, basically, they would be attached to the judiciary. So the court system, one of the branches of the court system are those that have been certified by the court as credible witnesses, udul. And why is that important? Because you go and you pay them, and they come and they witness your contracts. And you know that their testimony that it's going to be good because the court has already pre-certified them. So I tried to find out if all the references as to professional witnesses in the Islamic legal practice, whether I could find a reference ever to women acting as professional witnesses. And maybe there is, but I've never found one. And that's very interesting, because despite the Quranic interjection, social practice, which is wedded to its patriarchal habits, couldn't, if I am correct, and in fact, I've learned through hard way that be very careful when you generalize about anything in Islamic history, because whatever you generalize about, there will be some exception somewhere, sometime. Islamic history is extremely complex, extremely vast. You always find things. So I have not found a reference to women as professional witnesses, which is very interesting because I don't think that patriarchal institutions, which is again part of human history, unmistakable part of human history, could knew what to do. And it's not they knew what to do was the two women part. They didn't know what to do with women witnessing contracts part in the first place. And even jurists go more than that. And, then they try to say, well, women's testimony, two women equal one man, it could be in debts and financial contracts, but not in marriages. Meaning women cannot act as witnesses in a marriage contract. And you ask the question, well, why? Well, because we have a prescription to, and then they always in some type of argument about why you can't extend the qiyas from an analogy, an extension of rule by analogy from the field of debts and sales does not extend to marriages or bequests or inheritances. So the dynamic is a dynamic of exclusion of women. So, I get this question quite often when say, well, how come women are equal to men? And I say, well, the problem is to get women involved in the first place at all. Even in growing up in when I grew up in Egypt and Kuwait, it was I've never encountered a situation where a woman was witnessed a sales contract or a debt or even in a marriage. I mean, it's very radical till today. But my argument to you, as when I wrap up Surah Al-Baqarah to you, is that the exceptional act was Allah telling us include the testimony of women, which means that once there is no reason to accommodate the biases of patriarchy, in fact, Allah's interjection is like a normative trajectory. Allah is challenging us to get to that point. I don't think that by when Allah provides explanation, the explanation is so that if one of them forgets, the other will remind her. It's for who? It's responding to a human anxiety, human concern. Well, if that anxiety is not justified anymore and not present anymore, then what's the reason for it's if we get to the point where we know that there are women who are far more competent in financial and economic issues and transactional issues and legal issues than men, we get to a point where we know that a woman sitting on the Supreme Court knows far more law than it would be blatantly absurd to still say, well, so if one of them forgets, the other can remind her. Okay, we'll inshallah come back to that. Okay. There is an exception to this rule, and again, I'm simplifying a lot of complexity in legal arguments, but that if there is a circulating trade, in other words, there is, and this, by the way, again, is a massive issue in law, and meaning if you're in comparative law, the fact that the Quran recognizes a course of conduct exception blows my mind, because this is very advanced for its age. In Roman law, course of conduct exceptions didn't exist in Justinian Roman law. And in the old legal systems, the idea that there's contracts that are not part of the course of conduct and the contracts that are part of course of conduct, and that the actual terms of a contract can be determined by regular practice. So that, for instance, if I the contract with you and I don't specify time for delivery, but the time of delivery, so I don't specify a time of delivery, but there is a course of conduct. There is a way that business has been done with selling this material between these parties for a long time, and I go to that course of conduct and I say, well, look, normally the time for delivery is X day on X time, so I don't actually need to write it, but in fact it is defined by the course of conduct. That's pretty advanced. I mean, okay, there is an exception that the traveling exception, or if you are in circumstances where it's become really an inconvenience to write something. But the exception itself is not what's significant. But what is significant is the way that Allah explains the law to us. It's not the law, it's the explanation that educates us about why the law. Look, فَإِنْ أَمِنَ بَعْضُكُمْ بَعْضًا فَلْيُؤَدِّ الَّذِي اؤْتُمِنَ أَمَانَتَهُ وَلْيَتَّقِ اللَّهَ رَبَّهُ وَلَا تَكْتُمُوا الشَّهَادَةَ وَمَنْ يَكْتُمْهَا فَإِنَّهُ آثِمٌ قَلْبُهُ وَاللَّهُ بِمَا تَعْمَلُونَ عَلِيمٌ. So Allah reminds us that, listen, I'm teaching you to protect yourself through writing. I'm teaching you to have witnesses so that there is a way that we can authenticate signatures or seals or whatever. I know that this is inconvenient for you because most of you are illiterate, and it was obvious that that's going to put a great deal of emphasis on either obtaining those who can write, in other words, getting their help, or that it's going to become a professional, as till subhanallah, my grandparents, in a country like Egypt, there used to be professional people that they would always sit in front of mosques, and you go and you pay them to write letters for you, because illiteracy was at such a high rate that people who could write, have good handwriting, you actually go and they would sit with ink and paper in front of a mosque, and you go and you hire them and you say, can you write me a petition to the governor? Can you write me a letter to my friend or a brother or whatever? Can you and you pay them for it? And of course it was foreseeable that that this profession will be born, but also it's going to put a some pressure towards literacy, so people can actually read. And that's why, and we have ample evidence of that in the Prophet ﷺ emphasizing literacy and learning reading and writing as a jihad, as an obligation of Muslims, etc., etc. But now, so write contracts, witness contracts, involve women in the process of witnessing. So, stop excluding women from financial circles, etc., etc., and then the course of conduct type of issue. And if you are traveling, then or there's hardship, then there's the special circumstance. But what Allah educates us is the underscoring that none of this is worth anything without amana. So the principle is man tumina falyuaddi amanatuh, as the Quran puts it, that in all situations, it is like me telling you, listen, I want you to take these precautions, and here are my advice as to this and to this. But then I come and say, you know what, with all the precautions, if your intentions are not good, this is not going to work. I teach you, okay, don't hurt witnesses, don't disabuse your practices of exploitation, of power exploitation, whether by taking advantage of the need of people, whether demanding that, holding not just the person who is in need responsible for the debt or the transaction, but also whoever they can bring to support them, in other words, the witnesses. But I come and tell you, but listen, without amana here, without honesty, and that magical element that if you know that you owe someone an obligation, then discharge it. None of this is going to work. So this is precisely in law what we say good faith, right? Like, in law, how do you legislate good faith? Even when a judge rules on good faith, the reason good faith is often, there's a famous book called The Death of Contract. It was written about the common law. His author, I think, is called Gilmore. It's a book that law students used to read, but no more. Anyway, and it talks about the fact that judges, among other things, talks about the fact that judges and courts no longer want to rule on good faith. And as a result, very abusive contracts and very unfair contracts are allowed to exist. Why? Because how does a judge rule on a good faith? A psychologist will come and say, stay in your lane. Do theology and law because you don't understand good faith. That's psychology, right? So good faith, that's a psychological thing. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala comes and tells you, Allah knows what's in your heart. And without that magical element, it's not going to work. And وَلْيَتَّقِ اللَّهِ, so وَلْيَتَّقِ اللَّهِ رَبَّهُ, that this critical element of taqwa, self-explanatory. وَلَا تَكْتُمُوا الشَّهَادَةِ, and then underscores that so much of the deviance that we witness in financial transactions is that people do not fully attest to what they know to be true. That they suppress the entire truth, or some of the truth, or fudge the truth. That they say, I don't know, or I don't remember, or, again, goes back to the good faith, not just of the contractors, but the social circle around the contracting process. And when Allah says, وَمَنْ يَكْتُمُهَا فَإِنَّهُ آثِمٌ قَلْبُهُ, I remember this from years ago. There was one of Sheikh Wadi, Allah yarhamu, was commenting on this verse, and one of the students that I think was dense, Allahu A'lam, but I think he was dense. He asked Sheikh Wadi, he said, well, Allah says, فَإِنَّهُ آثِمٌ قَلْبُهُ, means their heart is impure, their heart is sinful. He said, well, doesn't this mean that it's a small sin? Because if it was a big sin, that Allah would have said, whoever conceals shahada, I will burn them in hellfire. But if Allah says, whoever conceals shahada, then their heart is sinful, doesn't this mean it's not a big deal to conceal shahada? And, of course, Sheikh Wadi was a very nice man. He was very patient and responded to it very quietly and very patiently, which I don't think I would have done. I probably would have blown my top, started berating that guy for his idiocy. But the reason I mentioned the story, other than the fact that I remembered it for the first time maybe in 30 years, and remembered the guy's face, but anyway, is that, you see, when Allah tells you that athamun qalbu, this is a remarkable expression. It's like saying, then your heart is defective. This is far more troubling. If you have real piety, this is far more troubling than a threat that you might ultimately, that threat Allah might punish you or might not punish you, depending on whether Allah forgives you or not forgives you or whatever. But when Allah says your heart is corrupt, it is like saying, take a deep look inside of yourself, because you're not a good human being. To borrow what Sheikh Wadi said, that if you have true piety, this would make you lose sleep. I say, if you have true piety, this would make your knees shake. So it means my heart is corrupt. I am no good. Are my prayers accepted? Are my fasting accepted? This heart is a rotted heart. Okay. And then Allah reminds you, right after this, taking us again back to first principle, that remember that whether you conceal or hide, Allah knows. There's no hiding anything. All of this, all of these technicalities is because you need it as human beings to manage your affairs. But when it comes to Allah's accountability, all of these technicalities are exactly that. They're superficial matters. Because Allah knows. لله ما في السماوات وما في الأرض وإن تبدوا ما في أنفسكم أو تخفوه يحاسبكم به الله. That whether you conceal it or you don't conceal it, you will be held accountable. Okay. Then we reach the very last passage of Surah Al-Baqarah. What follows this and the closing of Surah Al-Baqarah is reaffirmation first of our basic creed. آمن الرسول بما أنزل إليه من ربه والمؤمنون كل آمن بالله وملائكته وكتبه ورسله لا نفرق بين أحد من رسله. So first, Allah differentiating between the prophets is Allah's business. Allah holding this prophet special, this prophet in a special, that's Allah's business. You believers, you human beings, as Muslims, you believe in what Allah sent, the books of Allah, the revelation, that Allah's revelation is consistent, and without even needing to know what is in this revelation prior to the Quran, that it is an affirmation of the affirmation time and time again of the truth of the Quran, and that angels and messengers are a truth, are a haqq, and that when you understand your moral positioning, you are a continuation of the same message that Allah has been sending to human beings from your father Ibrahim alayhi salatu wasalam to Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam. But then what follows is one of the most remarkably tender parts of the Quran. لا يكلف الله نفسا إلا وسعها لها ما كسبت وعليها ما اكتسبت ربنا لا تؤاخذنا إن نسينا أو أخطأنا ربنا ولا تحمل علينا إصرا كما حملته على الذين من قبلنا ربنا ولا تحملنا ما لا طاقة لنا به واعف عنا واغفر لنا وارحمنا أنت مولانا فانصرنا على القوم الكافرين. So this amazingly tender dua that Allah teaches us. One of my lasting memories is Sheikh Ghazali, one of his last, it was just shortly, a few years before he died. He was starting a lecture, and then he started with the lecture by repeating this dua. And as he was repeating this dua, he cried. And it was a very big hallway, and all of us were crying. Just and for me, that's an indication of a man who his heart has become the Quran. So what Allah reminds us, and I'll explain in a second why this comes at the very end, that the principle is that Allah does not ask a soul to bear more than it can. And that accountability and responsibility is individual. and that the prayer is that the hope, the prayer, the aspiration is that you are not weighed down and burdened by the legacy of your forebears, that you don't end up being punished effectively for what those who came before you have done by having to bear the consequences of their deeds. And that Allah doesn't ask of you more than you are able to do. And that wa'fu anna, waghfir lana, warhamna, that forgiveness and mercy, and that ultimately Allah supports you so that you can persevere in being victorious against those who are your detractors, those who are opposed to your path. Now, this long journey in Surah Al-Baqarah, when you look at the final prayer, it is what Allah has been, what Allah started talking about when He started relating or addressing the legacy of the Israelites and educating Muslims to learn from the legacy of the Israelites. And then in this journey with all the prescriptive commands and the laws, Surah Al-Baqarah ends with this supplication. Muslim theologians dealt with something, of course, quite obvious. If Allah says your supplication, or you first become aware and you pray that لا يكلف الله نفسا إلا وسعها لها ما كسبت وعليها ما اكتسبت ربنا ولا تؤاخذنا إن نسينا وأخطأنا. Don't Allah forgive us if we forget or we make a mistake. Allah don't saddle us with the mistakes of those of our forebears. Allah don't put upon us more than we can bear. And Allah forgive us and have mercy upon us, and so on. If this is the supplication, does this intimate a normative command about how we relate to the laws, how we relate to the law itself? So is basically Allah saying that what this prayer is also telling you something about the ultimate conclusion about your attitude towards the law. And remember, the law is a consistent theme in Surah Al-Baqarah, as we'll talk about when we summarize everything. And the majority gave a clear yes, that ultimately, a priori, remember that the principle of morality is التخلق بأخلاق الله, that we incorporate and we internalize the ethical qualities that are taught to us through the ethical qualities that Allah adopted as describing Allah's self. I have an article about ethics and Islamic law that talks about this, if you're interested in reading the it's of course the more the scholastic tradition. And so then ultimately the law itself must a consistent theme in administering the law is that you do not place upon people more than they can bear. You do not burden people with more than they are able to handle. And that the attitude of ghufran and afu and rahmah are consistent themes that the law must aspire to: forgiveness and mercy. And something that modern Muslims don't talk a lot about, and the attitude of the law must be to contribute to the intisar al-Muslimin, meaning that the law ultimately must contribute to the empowering of Muslims, that the law cannot be an instrument of disempowerment for Muslims. So the law cannot impose upon people more than they can bear. The law, translated in concrete legal terms, that the law cannot be an instrument for hardship. Modern Muslims often, when the minute you talk about this, they jump to the laws of darura. The laws of darura, or necessity, are exceptions that are created to respond to special circumstances under narrow set of facts, or individualized set of facts. But here, these are normative like a normative compass for the law. It is not a matter of the laws of necessity don't address the ultimate issue of whether in fact the law exhibits afw wa ghufran wa rahmah, whether the law exhibits forgiveness and mercy. And it, as in the same way that simply the mechanics of the law don't answer ultimately whether the law leads to the empowerment of Muslims or not, al-intisar lil-Muslimin or not. Now, take a deep breath, because inshallah, now I summarize Surah Al-Baqarah. So, remember, this is the first long surah right after the Hijrah. A surah that handled nothing short of the position of Muslims, the trajectory of Muslims right after the establishment of a polity. Right after Mithaq al-Medina, the so-called Constitution of Medina, that is negotiated and written. Unfortunately, we don't have a copy of the Mithaq that survived, a copy that goes back 1400 years. We have just reports, or what survived are copies of the original copy, and with different manuscripts having slightly different terms reported. But anyway, so but after the Mithaq, there, notice Surah Al-Baqarah now handles the first critical issue, and the mithaq Allah, that the Allah's covenant, and who bears Allah's covenant. And it takes us back first in rebutting and challenging the idea that Allah's covenant is held ethnically, racially, or as a matter of entitlement. And it challenges the Israelite belief that they are the bearers of Allah's covenant and thus Allah's chosen people. But in doing so, it challenges the idea of a chosen people altogether. And then takes you back to the allegory of Adam and Eve, and that placing of responsibility, underscoring the underscoring that what the element of choice and volition and capacity to understand, which is going to become, of course, this notion of capacity, which sort of underscores the theme of human responsibility and the theme of volition and the theme of choice as justifying even what Allah knows will happen, and that Allah knows that human beings will choose what is wrong. And because they will choose what is wrong, they will do and commit a lot of evil, ifsad fil ard. But yet at a deep philosophical level, the miracle of volition itself the miracle of choice, and as Ghazali says, it's partaking of something in divinity, because it's only the divine that actually has that power, justifies this symbolic act of prostration. Not because Allah wants angels or shaitan or whatever, or angels and jinn to worship Adam, but the symbol of honoring the covenant and the inheritance and this ultimate issue of choice. Then Surah Al-Baqarah takes you to a close narrative about those who were a living example of people who handled the covenant and interacted with the covenant. And in doing so, it also passes through Ibrahim alayhi salam as where the patriarch or the father of Tawheed. Why? In part to tell Israelites, you claim effectively moral ownership of the legacy of Ibrahim, but the legacy of Ibrahim is not yours. The legacy of Ibrahim belongs to Tawheed. That is what it was all about. And it's not about a chosen people, and it's not about a historical legacy. It's not about the story of a particular historical dynamic that took place in the past. It is about the principle of Tawheed itself. And then in addressing this, the example of the Israelites, which the Surah Al-Baqarah addresses with layers of complexity, because on the one hand it talks about those who received a command to fight and didn't want to fight, or those who were liberated and preferred oppression and wanted to go back to their oppressors because they preferred luxury or they preferred comforts of life. It talks about those who related to the law in a very pedantic and myopic way, wanting the law to be about clear-cut details and losing sight of the basic principle. It takes you to the whole, a layered narrative to those who violate clear, specific commands, the Sabbath in this case. And as a result, Allah abandons themselves, and as the Quran describes it, they become as if apes, meaning that they live for their own pleasures, and that's it, they're like animals. And it takes you to an example of the Israelites actually fighting successfully in the story of David and his defeat of Jalut, and an example at the same time of the type of sacrifice and discipline that is required in the story of the river and drinking from the river as on the path to battle, and so on. And in this narrative, what you are seeing is like a narrative about the struggle, life and its struggles itself. Because when you look at this narrative, and you will find that there are pharaohs everywhere, and there are those who those who submit to the pharaohs everywhere. There are those who want to defy the pharaoh. There are those who will have an opportunity to be liberated, but will choose not to be liberated. There you will have those who will lose sight of what God's covenant is about and make it about a particular historical struggle or a particular ethnic group or a particular racial group. You will have, all of these are parallels that you can find yourselves in. You know, there isn't just one pharaoh, but there are pharaohs of every age. There isn't just one David, but there's a David of every age. There isn't just one Jalut, there's a Jalut in every age. There are those that Allah appoints as kings, and they are oppressors and deserve to be resisted in every age. Okay. In this Surah al-Hayah, in this constant struggles of life, Surah al-Baqarah underscores time and again that there are as if underlying foundational anchoring principles. Allah is close. Allah is always close. You go astray when you lose sight that Allah is ever present, and that Allah is always with you. But that Allah is always close, and that it is always about your relationship to Allah and with Allah. Time and time again, Surah Al-Baqarah takes us to this. It's like saying nothing will work if you lose sight of this. Now, and notice, as we've talked about, that part of the Israelite narrative is to also talk about those who tujar al-kalam, or those who are, they are merchants or manipulators of words, of talk, of the way that speech itself can be manipulated, and that although the essence of the covenant relies on the word, the most dangerous things that happens to the word, and when the word becomes trapped and cheapened by those who trap it, because the word becomes meaningless. Then part of this, Surah Al-Baqarah focuses on this element of duality that you find consistently among those who cheapen the word. And that is the role of what the Quran calls al-munafiqun, the hypocrites. Those who can speak charismatically, can speak beautifully, but ultimately, when you look at their moral behavior, or can in fact sell people upon to accept injustice, to accept what is wrong, to accept what is immoral. And that the dangerous role of the manipulators of truth and the manipulators of speech then Surah Al-Baqarah then takes you through a number of moral themes that it underscores. So it talks about al-dhulm, injustice, and that it is never the case that the unjust can be described as part of God's covenant. Injustice and God's covenant cannot mix. And talks about the sharaha or tama, or greed and materialism, and the tendency to value things or to measure all things by selfish standards, and standards of me and me alone as an egocentric paradigm. It talks about qulub al-qasiyah, or cruelty, and hearts that no longer can respond to the call of the divine or the call of morality. and the danger that comes from when this cruelty of the heart or the hardness of the heart sets in. Okay. Then it emphasizes to Muslims that this moral path, be aware that this moral path ultimately clearly understands that God and to God alone is judgment. And that the practice of claiming that, as Christians claim that, heaven is for them alone, or Jews claim that heaven is for them alone, is not the Muslim way. The Muslim way is doing what is morally right and saying and accepting that God is meticulously just and is unjust to no one. And understanding the limits of what human beings have competency over. Then after having given the examples of the way that the examples of the past, using the Israelites as the main example, then there is the Quran, the Surah Al-Baqarah is going to respond to a series of issues that came up in Medina, responses that are prescriptive, that will say, do this or do not do this. But before doing that, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reminds us that it is not about the mechanics, that yes, there will be prescriptive commands, but understand that it is not about, as the Quran puts it, a qibla, or the direction, that wherever you direct your face, you will find Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So, again, a reminder that law, or at least readying the receiver to understand that it is finding the path in life is not about the technicalities of al-busala, or the compass. That yes, we have the technicalities of how we face Mecca, but this is not what it's about. Having then laid that foundation, the Quran, the Surah Al-Baqarah, proceeds to address a number of issues in response to actual questions that have come up, whether relating to prayer, relating to Hajj, relating to Safa and Marwa, relating to the principle of punishment, relating to marriage and divorce, the rights of divorcees, the rights of widows, the rights for support and maintenance, and eventually debt and contracts. But the trajectory in all of these, I would submit to you that if you study these laws carefully, the trajectory in all of these is something that if you have any reasonable moral foundation, if you have even a basic understanding of morality, you would find that the trajectory of all of these laws was the protection of the unprotected and the empowerment of the disempowered, not in absolute and ideal terms, but in relational terms. That a problem came up, how can I achieve greater equity, greater fairness within the circumstances possible? If you talk about equity in absolute terms, regardless of the facts on the ground, equity can very quickly turn into either provisions of law that are meaningless, that people just completely ignore them, as if done with women witnessing, for instance, or, in fact, idealized law often produces precisely the opposite. Often when people look at institutions of law or the sociology of law, they ask the question, why is it that judges or lawyers or legal practice, even comparative legal sociology, why is it that they often work in such incremental terms and avoid philosophical purity or things that are philosophically pure? And the reason is that when you are trying to achieve actual results on the ground that lead to greater sociological equity, you cannot afford, at a legal level, philosophical purity. You can't just talk in absolute terms and achieve sociological results that are more equitable. But the mistake that Muslims often fall into is precisely the mistakes that so many nations in the past have fallen into. And that is to think, to imagine that just because the legal prescriptive commands have produced what was sociologically more equitable under a certain set of circumstances, then that's the total sum of the matter, or sum total of the matter. The philosophical purity is understood at a moral and ethical level, and it must remain as an aspiration to law, achievable in relative terms as is possible under different times and places. But to take talaq or inheritance or this or that and say, well, you know, and that doesn't mean that we just simply ignore the prescriptions, and because then we're ignoring the educational process that Allah sent to us. Allah sent us this so that we can study it, to educate ourselves as to the mechanics of reform. And so here, what is critical in this dynamic are these moral foundations that Allah sets for us as ultimate aspirational goals that everything, the way we relate to the covenant, the way we relate to the principle of taklif, of obligation, and this is a very big statement, by the way, the way that we relate to volition and choice, the way that we relate ultimately to the very epistemology, the system of knowledge, of learning from the legal applications, is always informed and shaped by these underlying foundations that Allah sets for us. So, what is anchored is this revolutionary idea that you are Ummatul Wasat. And as we said, Ummatul Wasat, the nation, the medium, is always relational. So you always understand, it's like saying to you, what I expect from you is to do what is reasonable. Well, if you are a jerk, you'd say reasonable, what does that mean? I'm just going to ignore this advice. I'm not going to learn anything from it. But if you're not a jerk, you say reasonable. Okay, well, I cannot be reasonable unless I am also relational. Because reasonability cannot be defined in absolute terms. It always has to be defined in terms of what the parameters are. So when Allah says that you are Ummatul Wasat, and not just Ummatul Wasat just so we can come to Allah and say, look, we were Wasat, but that you have, this is tied into an obligation that you are to witness upon humanity, then Allah has challenged you to be at the forefront of the moral arc of reasonability. At the forefront of the moral arc of reasonability. Within this is, as we talked about, the extensive discussions about khair and adl and fadl. Goodness, justice, and fadl, benevolence. What is, or as many have said, the al-fadl wal-ihsan, shay'un wahid, that they're the same thing, that the benevolence and goodness is to go beyond justice. And Allah underscores the role of the kitab as guidance and hikmah as guidance. And we've talked about that. Hikmah, wisdom as guidance. And Allah underscores in this the entire teaching about thinking that there are any instrumentalities that fast track your relationship to Allah or mediate your relationship to Allah for you, like law or like institutions of power. That's shafa'ah that we talked about. And Allah underscoring that, remember, in understanding or in as this moral foundation, that dhulm, not just dhulm but injustice, but taghut, oppression, and as we said, tughyan is to go beyond what each deserves according to the right, are inconsistent with Allah's covenant and with whatever the instrumentalities that Allah has given you as you think through applying them. And as in 188, Allah reminds us, blindly surrendering to the hukam, that blindly just saying, well, we surrender our affairs to those in charge, let them guide us. That your active part is, what is the, when you study the seerah and the story of the companions of the Prophet ﷺ, what is the thing that strikes you the most about the so-called golden age, the Khulafa al-Rashidun, is that people took an actual personal interest in the affairs of everything. People were actually personally involved. The idea of telling people, just trust us. Now, it is naive and childish to think that the instrumentalities that were appropriate to achieve this 1400 years ago, like a woman standing in the mosque telling Omar you're wrong, when Omar wanted to put a limit on how much women can ask for a dowry, that this is appropriate for our age. The challenge is for our age to come up with instrumentalities that achieve the same thing. Yes, we can't guarantee that the person who's ruling is going to be a Omar who reacts very humbly to a woman reprimanding him. But so what instrumentalities are you going to put in place? That's really achieving God's covenant. Not sitting on our behinds and saying, well, you know, lillahi al-mulk, وَلِلَّهِ الْأَمْرُ وَالْبَعْدِ مِنْ قَبْلُ مِنْ بَعْدِ. Allah, just, it's all up to Allah. And that's not bearing the covenant. And don't forget the most critical element repeated in Surah Al-Baqarah, and it will come back again in Surah Al-Imran, by the way. But in Surah Al-Baqarah, in 177 and in 188, al-birr, that key concept that has been completely ignored by modern Muslims, that al-birr is, as you recall, from 177 and 189, sorry, we spoke, 177 and 189, that it is your salah, it is your iman, but it is in relationship to material things. It is taking responsibility for those that are of an immediate charge, but also taking responsibility like your relatives, but also taking responsibility for the disempowered, the masakin, واليتامى, وابناء السبيل, the displaced, the orphans, and so on. And that you spend from what you love, and that you understand that they are not less than you in worth, so that if you relate to them in any way, but remember that part of al-birr is that key element of dignity, that in giving you cannot injure their dignity. And if you are going to injure their dignity, then it's better not to give. And a remarkable moral foundation when Allah says ادخلوا في السلم كافة, that this path, this dynamic is, as we said when we talked, it's like we said, it is the searching for nirvana. Oppression, injustice, need are inconsistent with that spiritual state. A person who learns to be scared will learn hypocrisy. And if you learn hypocrisy, you learn to lie. And the idea of silm becomes impossibly elusive. Or, like as we see in the modern age, you oppress people by telling them, if you express an opinion, I will throw you in prison forever. But I will make you happy by bringing in rappers and naked people and, everything that will distract you. That's not silm. That's not silm. Remember what we said about what Sheikh Muhammad Abdul says, that if only Muslims understood the narrative of Surah Al-Baqarah, especially particular passage that we talked about, that the idea of despotism would have never been allowed to take root in Muslim societies. And of course, this is a clear, the whole context and discourse in La Ikraha fi Din, that the idea of coercion itself is a moral problem, because coercive societies that rely on the instrumentality of law and the threat of punishment, either the actual punishment or the threat of punishment, to obtain people's consent rather than persuasion, are societies in which immorality will sprout under darkness. People learn to conceal what is there in their hearts, to do what is wrong, but in absolute darkness, and to become morally meek and irresponsible. And then it is then taking you to this, as I said, remarkably tender closing of saying this is about a moral path, rising to the responsibility of the covenant, not being God's chosen people, because there are no God's chosen people, but being God's people, not because you're entitled, but because you are morally, in fact, the embodiment of God's people. But this path, you must understand that you will not achieve it, not just through, you cannot achieve it through coercion, but you cannot even achieve it if you are ignoring the nature of people and ignoring the sociology of people and ignoring the psychology of people by asking people to bear what they cannot. Now, it's here, remember the standard of reasonability again. When I say be reasonable, it's different because Allah doesn't tell us how to exactly strike that balance. Strike the balance between being morally upright and not using ease or not burdening people as an excuse to do what is immoral. It's a very difficult balance. And that's precisely what hikmah is. How are you going to strike that balance? That requires an enormous amount of wisdom. Meaning an enormous amount, in modern language, an enormous amount of education. In order to, and it cannot be struck by one person. It is, we can't forget what the Quran has taught us about Surah. And about the fact that we need to be able to have a situation where we're not like the pharaohs, but where if people are starting to lean towards the wrong path, they can be corrected by their sisters and brothers. So if the atmosphere is oppressive and suffocating, then the chances that you can actually strike that battle, it becomes far more elusive and far more difficult. So it is not an exaggeration to say that Surah Al-Baqarah, in its first revelation, took Muslims towards their entire attitude towards life. Because if you search on Surah Al-Baqarah, if you read through it enough times, you will find it so, at different parts, it bespeaks a parallel to something you've experienced in life. And you will say, oh, I've experienced this, depending on when you read it in your life. Oh, I felt this. Morality and law. Morality and law. The toughest challenges that have confronted human beings ever since human beings have become literate enough to articulate these two concepts, although I suspect they've always innately felt them. How do we strike that balance? And that's what Surah Al-Baqarah is about. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Okay, I'm going to call it. And alhamdulillah, we finished Surah Al-Baqarah. Grace will... Now you have to summarize Surah Al-Baqarah all over again. No, I'm kidding.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. God help me. This was so incredible. Okay, so I was just scribbling, literally 7 or 8 pages just on the summary portion. And, started to take notes from the beginning. Oh my God. You feel like you've been buried under a mountain. First of all, there are no words to express. You have to appreciate genius and hard work, right? So in the last 8 pages, whenever we started this summary, it's just striking. It's like when you see someone summarizing 13 days, Surah Baqarah, like a symphony, pulling in all the different pieces, and even the fact, I mean, it's like I can't even, you know, like you write it down and you can't keep track of it. But to watch someone who obviously has dedicated an entire lifetime to studying this and internalizing it, and then being able to prepare and present it to us in this way, I mean, you just cannot find this anywhere else. I mean, you know, it's not fair, you know, I mean, it's like seeing a Mozart in our time, you know. And like when I just a side story, you know, like I was curious, I don't know if I talked about this before, but I was looking around on, you know, to see other Muslim organizations or places where people were sharing tafsir. And I think I had found, you know, someone presenting, I think it was Surah Mudaththir or something like that, or Mutaffifin, over 5 days, which is a short surah. You know, for us, we covered it in like a day. And then, you know, to see like the difference between what we were able to achieve in this just one session, just in the summary portion, is unbelievable. I mean, this is something that you could literally spend your entire lifetime studying, just, you know, one portion of what we covered in this surah. I think that the gift that you've given us, like I don't think I've ever understood. Well, I mean, to be honest, I mean, I've read Surah Baqarah and the Quran, and, you know, when you don't have a way to understand its entirety, you really only understand verses. And I think that's how, you know, Muslims tend to like interact with the Quran in general. It's just a verse by verse engagement. But to take the longest surah and then, you know, navigate it and present it to us in a way that we understand. I mean, like, this is truly God creating, like, telling us, this is the answer. This is how we should create life. How you get to nirvana, right? I mean, we need our own term for nirvana, but in, you know, silm, I mean, but it's like, how do you create sort of a perfect society, and perfect in the sense that it's a way that human beings, it's so sensitive to, and it's something that only a creator could give you, right? I understand how I created you. I understand you're all different. You're all unique. You all deserve to be empowered. You all deserve to have dignity. I understand that you're not going to give each other dignity, but if you're going to do that, and if you're going to be among the few people that are committed to this path of reasonableness, and nuance and light and beauty, here's how you do it. But it's like such a symphony of ideas and concepts, new and, you know, and eternal and primordial. So, you know, like, even I'm just thinking in terms of overarching things. You know, we hear a lot about how the arc of the moral arc of the universe bends towards justice, right? Is this like expression that people understand, but like through Surah Baqarah, it's like the idea of the moral trajectory bends towards beauty and reasonableness, and is for us to define relatively, like bit by bit, relationally. You write about this in Reasoning with God, and it's like God has laid out this moral trajectory that is aspirational, and here are the tools, and here's the education, and here's how you can achieve this step by step in whatever time you're living in. So if you're 1400 years ago, here's how we make an incremental change that allows you to set the moral trajectory to something more beautiful. And then here now 1400 years have advanced, and here we are today. And all of these lessons are just as relevant, just as intuitive, just as profound. And it's like, okay, now we've made some progress on that moral trajectory, but we have such a long way to go. And we've forgotten these principles. And here we are now, we can recapture like these things that God is telling us in Surah Baqarah to get on that moral trajectory again. Although the irony is that, you know, I don't think anyone no one got this message. No one got this understanding of Surah Baqarah until you laid it out for us. It's so profound. And I think just to, like, today, oh my God, there's just so much to say. So it's a really, like starting today, let's just start with what we covered about the idea of this higher order normative command, and even helping us understand like how our modern empirical mind has a hard time understanding things like abstract, like just be kind and just forgive debt, or like trying to think in a moral way where you can recognize someone's morality and have that affect you. Like if you met a merchant, 1400 years ago, and you see, or that this person operates in such a beautiful way, they have such a beautiful character, that's an invitation for you to even think about what faith do they follow, versus our mindset today, which is so much about, I need to see it, I need to touch it, give me the rule, and why would I forgive someone's debt? This is just, and just like highlighting that as an idea that even for us to understand this Quranic message, we have to recognize the empiricism that's baked into our time and try to look beyond that to understand, to get at that abstract notion of being kind and accepting the principles that the Quran is telling us. And just the fact that ethics has been reduced to, as you said, black letter law, and that the attitude oftentimes in teaching ethics is, well, let's just check it off the box, get it done, let's move on, because we can't talk about spirituality or God forbid mention the word God, because that's just not acceptable in our secular world. And how other religions have basically retreated. And so for us, with this message that we received today, this is an opportunity for Muslims to add back to this narrative of, ethics requires a spiritual engagement. It has to speak to you as a human being, and has to speak to, your intuitive nature. So, and then, there's nothing, you gave such a beautiful summary. There's no point in me going through all of that. But I think the thing that is just, again, striking is that God anticipated everything that we would need. There's everything in this surah alone for us to revolutionize how Muslims can interact with our world today. It obviously highlights the problems we have in understanding law, and how we understand morality, and even understanding, how to honor the dignity of individuals. And it's so beautiful because it starts with how do we empower and recognize, the beauty of each individual. So and this egalitarian idea that you can be a chosen person of God based on your actions, based on your ethics. It's not about ethnicity, it's not about entitlement, it's not about, anything other than what's inside and what you're able to do. So at the individual level, okay, we've been empowered. We've been, basically given license to elevate. And then at a communal level or a community level, how we need to empower people, empower the disempowered, protect the unprotected, build a society where people can thrive, and then how we deal with power and money, and not just giving in to the injustice, and that's not going to hold water with God. And then working basically then ultimately to achieve this ultimate nirvana. It's like, okay, that's the entire world, right? And so much nuance at every level. And then the education, that obviously you can't achieve these things without intelligence, piety, education, and the whole idea that we talked about, wisdom, meaning mastering necessary knowledge. So you have to master the epistemology of your age to be able to operate at this level and figure out what is reasonable and what is beautiful. There's just so much here. We could just, there's so much more that I'm sure that we could all sit here and discuss for the next, 10 years. But to have all of this literally at our fingertips in a summary in less than an hour is just, it just speaks to your mastery, your intelligence, piety, dedication over a lifetime, because obviously these things you can't just read in a book and figure out in even a year or two or any, I mean, this is a lifetime of work, and it's like we're so blessed to be here to receive it. And if we even understand just a small portion of what you conveyed, I think we're all so much better off. I know, like, where we were at the beginning of Surah Baqarah, knowing nothing. I remember, like, oh my gosh, I'm so excited, we're going to start on Surah Baqarah, knowing nothing, and then now 13 days later it's like the world has changed. And alhamdulillah, thank you so much for sharing your gift with us, and inshallah may we receive it appropriately and live up to, I think, the burden of responsibility now that we have this knowledge, and whether it's changing our lives or sharing it with others. Clearly, Islam and Muslims need this so badly, as a point of dignity, as a point of survival, as a point of fighting Islamophobia, and may we all play our part with whatever we were able to receive. So thank you so much. Anybody want to add anything? No? Okay. Thank you so much. Send me your questions. Looking forward to a whole engagement again, just next Wednesday, inshallah. So my email, grace@usuli.org. Send your questions my way. We will do our best to get through as many of them as we can. And thank you. I hope you guys are as affected as I am. This has been just an incredible time with Surah Baqarah. Alhamdulillah. Thank you so much. You guys have a wonderful rest of the weekend. Inshallah, we'll see you Wednesday. Assalamu alaikum.